Well, hello, and welcome to the next recorded lecture. We're going to start talking about all of the individual gaps now. So, gap one, understanding the customer. Remember that to get to gap one, you have to have a customer gap. In other words, there's a difference between expectations and perceptions. So once we know that we've got a difference, then we start to diagnose our problems and look at them. And the first gap that we want to look at is gap one. Okay, so what we have here is we have the expected service of the customer, and then we have the company's perception of the consumer expectations. So we have a gap. In other words, the company doesn't understand the perceptions of the guest, of the potential customer. That's what we're looking at here as being the challenge for gap one. So when we look at the factors that lead to gap one, we see inadequate market research, and we're going to talk a lot about that in this section in terms of what we can do and how we can do that. It's either insufficient, inadequate, whatever it may be. A lack of upward communication. In other words, perhaps the frontline employees are getting the feedback from the guest, but they're not feeding it through to the upper management. So that's an issue that probably will be addressed more in gap three when we get there, but that's another issue. Insufficient relationship focus. In other words, the company doesn't necessarily understand what the customer wants, and then they don't know how to build the relationship with them from that perspective. So they're not looking at long-term value, as we've talked about already. And inadequate service recovery we're going to cover later on in the semester. So knowing what the customer expects, that's how we close it. So we do research on expectations. So we want to know what the consumer wants in similar industries. So we do a comparison with that. We look at immediate past customer research. We can create customer panels, track satisfaction of individual transactions, and so on. We're using market research findings effectively in terms of how we then deal with those, in terms of understanding what the customer actually expects or wants, if you will. An increased interaction between management and the customers is another factor that management level may not understand what the customer really wants, even if the line people do. So management's got to get more in touch with customers. So the biggest issue here is management not understanding customers, management being the upper management within the organization. So improving customer perceptions is one of the issues we want to look for. We can do that by improving our service. Or we can lower the expectations of what should happen. In other words, perhaps we've been marketing, advertising things at a too high of a level, or maybe we've set our bar too high for what we should actually be in terms of the kind of facility we are. You know, if you're a limited service hotel, you can't bill yourself as a full service restaurant hotel, right? You can raise the expectations about what will happen. In other words, you can make things better than what people expected. So it's not to say that a limited service hotel has the same facilities as a five-star hotel, for example. We certainly know that, but there's nothing to say that we couldn't try and deliver the same kind of type of service attitude from our employees. Now, in order to do effective research, there's a number of different factors, and see that we're looking at expectations and perceptions of consumers. We have to look at kind of both to make the whole thing work. And we use qualitative and quantitative research, as this states. But we want to make sure that the research we're doing is also statistically valid. So it's not just looking at a number. We're making sure that it actually has some meaning to it. And we want to make sure that it's done at the most frequent periods of time, so it's not just something we're basing on 2 years ago we did this and therefore we're going to keep doing it. Obviously right now, with the COVID situation, there's lots of things that have changed. Now, you also want to look at doing this from a cost-effective standpoint. You have to look at your priorities of what's most important within whatever market segments you're dealing with, for example, and you have to look at what motivates people to return, loyalty, behavioral intentions. All those are factors within the research area. Now this gives you a little bit of a chart of, on the left you're seeing what the research objective is, and on the right, sorry about that, just clicked a few too fast. So I need to back those up a minute. Let me do that. Bear with me here as I'm trying a new method to go in reverse. Well, I don't want to change that. I want to change this. So I want to go here and I want to go back, back. Come on. It keeps giving me the wrong thing to look at here. I gotta move my face up. Okay, if I move my face up, I can move back. Here we go. Sorry about that. So live and we learn as we go through. I can move myself around. I just discovered that the first time I realized that I move myself around. And I need to do that when I'm doing this. So for example here, let's go back to the chart. If you want to identify dissatisfied customers' attempt to recovery, in other words, identify the most common categories of service failure, you might do some customer complaint solicitation. You might look at the customer complaints, and we'll talk a little bit about those kind of things. There we go, backwards again. Excuse me while I figure out where my mouse goes on this. Sometimes the mouse seems to disappear on me. There it is. Okay, so I want to go backwards here. How do I? There we go. Got it, finally. Okay. I'll leave my hands off of this thing. Hopefully it stays there. We can do relationship surveys, post-transaction surveys, or maybe guest satisfaction is kind of what we think of when we do those kind of things. Customer focus groups. We're going to talk more specifically about mystery shopping and service providers. Employee surveys. We'll talk more about that in GAP 3, but that's an important element. It's understanding from the employees what the customer is looking for example, in terms of the kind of things that we're seeing. Lost customer research, those that did not come to us, that turned us down, and future expectations research. These are all different aspects that we might look at in terms of meeting a research objective, the types of research that we might do. And now I'm going backwards. Okay, here we go. Back on track. So if we're looking at the stages in the research process, stage one is we define the problem. Okay, what is it that we need to be able to research? Is it a market segment, whatever it may be? Then we develop the measurement strategy for it, and we'll talk about some of those in terms of the types of measurements in the second part of the GAP 2 lecture. We implement the research program, we collect the data, we interpret and analyze it, and then we report the findings. Okay, so we start by defining the problem. That's a key point. We just don't start doing a research survey because it sounds like a good idea. We have to know what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So when we look at things now from a broader perspective of the industry, it kind of gives us an idea of maybe a benchmark or a barometer of where we ought to be from the research perspective. So this is U.S. hotels, right? This is a what's called an ASCII score. It's an organization that looks at customer satisfaction overall. And what you see on this particular chart, if I can get my cursor to go to the right place, when you look up at the top, you see Marriott and Hilton at the top at 80. And you see over time, they're relatively consistent, and 80 is one of the higher levels. They've improved a bit. The average for the industry, 75. And then you see some of the other hotel groups that are below 75 on here. Now, my question for you might be, is 80% good? 75. How would you feel if you got 75 out of 100 on the midterm? Well, think about that. Is that where you want to be? Is that the right number? Looking at full service restaurants, what we see here, if you look over on the to the shaded area and you see full service restaurants, they're at 79. So there's actually overall full service restaurants are rated a little bit more satisfactory. But when you look at the high-end restaurant chains, and these are the high-end chains up here, family restaurants, that is, full-service family type restaurants. The Longhorn Steakhouse, which is a Darden restaurant, they have a number of different chains and brands. They're at 80%, about the same as the top-level hotels. Once again, ask the same question. That's something for discussion. Now, where do we stand in terms of overall industries? Let's look at the restaurant industry itself. First off, you see here in the highlighted area, full-service restaurants are actually up fairly near the top, okay, at 82% up here, and you see 86, this benchmark's slightly different time frame perhaps than the other one, 86%, oops, sorry about that. And then down below, you see limited service here at 77. But you see where it stands with regards to all the others on this list. What is down here at the bottom? Telecommunication services, internet services, providers, and so on towards the bottom. That's certainly been my experience. I would rate them down there. I don't know about you in the Philippines, but certainly in the U.S. and my time in Singapore, I would say they belong down there. But up at the top, you see things like credit unions, soft drinks, some of those others. So we're comparing all industries here. And now you look at hotels. Hotels are a little bit lower. Where are they? Maybe they're a little bit below average here in terms of where we actually are looking. We're maybe a little bit below average in terms of that aspect of things, where the hotel stands. So again, we go back and ask the question, what does that mean? I'll leave that for you to discuss. Now, an interesting survey that was done by Deloitte, who does a lot of surveys within the hotel industry, of your generation, in other words, next generation hotel guests. They're looking at the guest experience. Remember, we talked about in the very beginning, we talked about the issue of the experience industry and the experience aspect. We talked about that in the power of moments. This is what we're talking about here in terms of the guest experience. And what this shows you here is how well we're doing in the hotel industry on various criteria within your generation. So, for example, here, if you look at the know me aspect, which is right in the center, right in here in the center, 65%. Know me means you know and remember their preferences and needs. Okay, that's important. And they found that if they don't do that, that the frequency, if you do that, the frequency increases by 13% in terms of the potential of getting that customer. You see over here on the left side, engage me. What does engage me mean? That means staff members interact with guests in a personalized, authentic method. Okay, that's the important aspect of it. Now, are they doing it? 38% of the respondents said that they had unfriendly team members leave for a negative stay, and then they won't return. That was just behind a dirty room, okay, in terms of what's there. So that's an important element. Hear me. Okay, hear me is that you listen to the guest needs and you empathize. Remember, going back to the dimensions here, we're empathizing. We're understanding the empathy with the customer and the customer situation, an important element. The highest rated over here is empower me, so the flexibility and the opportunity to design their stay. Now, certainly if you're looking at a 5-star type hotel, you'd expect that would be more prevalent than you would be, say, in a limited service property, that you'd be able to do more customizing, if you will, back to how we discussed that in the very beginning of categorization. And then the last one down here, oops, sorry about that. My cursor is moving faster than I am sometimes, I think, in terms of what's there. We'll learn this as we go through using this Loom method. You see, the delight me is to create moments of surprise for guests and exceed expectations. Okay, that's what we're looking at here. So exceeding expectations. Now, they're using that term, we would say, at the high end of the zone of tolerance. That's what we're talking about here in terms of what we need to do. So how well are they doing on that? 56%. Not so good compared to the others. That's what your generation is saying. So these are the discussion questions for our group 2.1, and we'll discuss those in class later. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. See you on the next one.